I make no secret that one of the things that I love to do is travel. I have a self-described gypsy soul. I've often spoke of the irony that God called me to return home to Damascus to live, because at the age of 18, I was going to, and I quote myself on this, get out of this closed-minded, one-horse hick town and never come back. That was my goal, my objective. My parents would tell you I spent every summer in high school working to get just enough money to take the next trip somewhere else. And I really enjoyed it. I still, to this day, I have this, there's nothing for me like being able to fire up the car, throw on a backpack, and just go and travel somewhere. In stories, I've always identified, when I'm reading stories, I've always identified with the wanderer, the pilgrim, the one that's kind of on the edges of polite society, moving around. Those are the people that really endear themselves to me. I love to travel. One of the blessings that we've had in our lives the last couple of years as our kids have gotten older, we've been able to take these what I call Great American Road Trips, where we've, last summer we did a road trip around California, and the summer before that we kind of hit the Midwest and then circled around and hit all of these national parks. And we travel pretty light, we like to camp and, all that kind of stuff. And it was really it's a great experience, these journeys, being able to kind of hit the road. And so what I want you to kind of notice as we've gone through this series on I Am This Kind of Christian, that each one kind of builds on the previous one, and that is intentional. Because this sermon series, I feel, is one of those things that mirror my own faith experience. And I'll kind of tell you what I mean. So whenever I was growing up, in a traditional church setting, faith was a lot about belief. And you had these certain things that you believed about Jesus, and then you acted this certain way. And the Bible was kind of the guidebook. But you pretty much, when you got to the salvation experience, you had arrived. And then you guys know my story. I began to get dissatisfied with that because I would always have questions. I was the person that always asked why or how this works. I was, every Sunday school teacher's worst nightmare. That's why I love kids that are that way, because I get them. I understand them. I really do. And so that paradigm of faith being something that I am sure of, this thing that I say that I believe, stopped working for me. And so I had to find something different. And as I grew up, I began to see that this faith, like anything else in life, it's a journey. It's a process. It's a path we're on. And the ones that are really good at it, the ones that are the ones that I really respect, they are kind of like the wanderers from the stories. They never quite fit into any particular category, but they're the most interesting ones. And so for this whole sermon series, it's kind of I'm kind of calling this kind of the journey to faith. Now, each sermon kind of stands on its own. It's a way stop. It's a thing to see. Like, if I was comparing it to our trip a couple years ago, it's its own little national park, and you can go and you can visit and you can explore. You're going to learn all kinds of great things. But the real experience of it is the journey on how you got there and where you're going to the next place. So we kind of began, and I want to kind of just do a little bit of a summary before we jump into the next part of this series. We began with the first place we went was that everything exists. Everything that exists was created by a something. And that something called everything good. That's kind of the jumping off point of faith that separates, if we're kind of looking at a roads, and roads have divisions, the thing that kind of separates somebody of faith from someone who would say is more bent towards atheism, well, the person of faith sees that this world is created by something. And we don't always I don't get into the deep part of the mechanics of it, but there is something behind this everything. It didn't just happen. It wasn't some cosmic accident. There's an order to it. And that order is good. And so then we decide, well, if something created it, then that something has to have some sort of sentience, some sort of self-awareness. It has to be something that's probably bigger than us. And so we call that something God. And in the second sermon, we kind of explored that this God is good and He's able to be trusted. And so if this God created everything, including us, and humans, we can look at ourselves and say we do occupy a very unique place in the universe. Humans were created to be a reflection of this God. Thus, humanity, us, we're dearly loved by God. But because we have this God reflection in us, we're given a choice. And thus, we can choose wrong. And let's face it, we choose wrong a lot. So we have this brokenness in us, this thing that we call sin. And all sin, all of it, can be summed up as a failure to love. Now, most of us, each of us, and I don't know a person in this church that doesn't long to live up to that God image. We're all seeking that thing, that God image within us. We want to be good people. But we also recognize that we're often not good. And so we live in this tension of who we are, where we find ourselves, and the person we want to be. Now, if you're like me, I have struggled with the question, the great mystery of life, why? Why? If God wanted us to truly reflect Himself, why did He give us this choice? Why did He make us mortal? And I know there have been many times when I have reached the point where I have royally messed up, which happens, let's face it, at least once a week, where I reach that point and I say, God, if you wanted me to be like you, why did you make me like me? Now, this is the thing where we've kind of talked about exploring the Bible and what the Bible gives us answers to and what the Bible doesn't. And we never get a satisfactory answer as to why. And in last week's sermon, I talked about Job. If you really want to kind of explore that, Job never gets the answer to why we're this way. And any one of them, whatever works for you is fine. If Marcus were God, and let's play this game because it's always a fun game to play. If Marcus were God, then I wouldn't give humanity a choice. If you have children, raise children, wouldn't it be nice if they always did what you said? But they don't. They're little reflections of us. They will do what they will do. But if I created the universe, it would be great if everybody just did what I said and what I wanted. But I'm not God. That's probably a good thing. So rather than give us an account of the why, the Bible is a story of humanity's attempt to live in this tension of the place we find ourselves and the place that we want to be. Knowing that there is a God creator, and that if He creates, He must love, and if He loves, we should too, but also knowing that we fail at it. See, the Bible is also an account of God's inviting humanity into a relationship with Him, despite the fact that we fail at it. God says, I know you're going to get this wrong, but come to me anyway, because I am the Creator and I can sustain you. Let me help you. Because here's the thing, men and women, if you're like me, and probably most of you figured out that you are not like me, I'm an odd duck, but maybe some of this stuff you are. You have tried to fix yourself on your own terms and you failed at it. In fact, you probably fail at it all the time. Because my first thought is never to go to God about things. My first thought is always to fix it myself. Because that's what I like to do. I'm a fixer. I'm going to fix it myself. But the thing is we find that we can't do it when we try to do it ourselves. So for us, God invites us in that anyway and says, come to me and give me all of your brokenness, all of this stuff. Let me help you on this journey. Let me show you how to live in this tension of the place where you find yourself and the place that you want to be. And we can journey towards that place together. But how do we get there? And this is where we come to today, where we kind of come to the thing that separates, I would say, Christianity from everything else. Because for us, the invitation comes in the form of the person of Jesus. And over the next few weeks, we're going to explore this concept of God's invitation to us through Jesus. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythm of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Now, this is the invitation. This is Jesus speaking. And it's found in the New Testament. But I want to ask an honest question. Who is Jesus? Now, that may seem like a funny question coming from a guy who claims to be a pastor, who says that, whenever I was going through my rebellious period, I missed church for like 6 straight weeks. So you would think if anybody would have a handle on this Jesus person, you would hope it's the guy sitting up front talking to you. Right? But here is the thing. While I've been a follower of Jesus most of my life, and while I seek to understand what Jesus wants from me and what it means to follow him, I don't always have a handle on him. But here's also the thing that I want you to know. The church itself has been trying to wrestle with this question of who is Jesus for the last 2,000 years. Because the church itself isn't quite sure. If they were, then why are there so many different denominations? Or independent churches also who don't want to be associated with denominations because they think denominations are evil and they have the right truth. It's baloney. Everybody who encounters Jesus, there's this thing where we read it a certain way and somebody else reads it a different way. Now, here's what some people do. They just dismiss this whole question of who is Jesus whenever they're asked about Jesus, because what they do is they just loudly insist that their vision of Jesus is right and everybody else is wrong. Now, if you've ever met some of these truly diehard people, they'll tell you some people are more wrong than others. I actually interacted with some people that consider their denomination, like if you've ever read anything in Revelation about there's the wedding banquet, and then everybody in their denomination are the people seated at the table, and all the rest of us, because I was included in that because I wasn't part of their denomination. I was asking about my status in their heaven. It said, don't worry, you're still a guest. And I was like, whoo, at least I'm a guest at the wedding. But you get the idea. We've been wrestling with this whole question about Jesus. And a lot of people, what they do is that they just dismiss everybody else. And that's easy, just to say, well, they've got it. I've got it right. You've got it wrong. Neener, neener, neener. And you'll find out in the end. But for me, that answer is so unsatisfying. Because if I'm honest, my own views about the nature and the work of Jesus has changed over time. I don't think about Jesus the same way I did last year, let alone 20 years ago. The more I study, the more I see of Jesus, but at the same time, more questions arise. Now, not in a skeptical, doubting kind of way, but in more of a, well, I didn't think of it that way. I wonder where this one's going to take me. And every time I find something somewhere that I think I can grab hold of, another question arises. And so I keep traveling on this journey. I arrive at a place and I find something else that I want to see. It's just like, that's the journey of faith. That's what it's about. And I think it's intentional because I think, we love certainty as humans. We like nice little boxes where we can explain everything. And Jesus always resists being put in a box. Now the funny thing is even when Jesus was here during his earthly ministry, people were always trying to put pressure on Jesus to conform to what their image of what he was supposed to be. At one point, they even forcibly decided to try to make him their king. I mean, could you imagine somebody come up to you and say, hey, I want you to be my king or queen. Equal opportunity around here. I'm going to dedicate my life to you. And you're going to tell me everything and how to live and that. I would, it'd be hard to turn down if somebody wanted to, make me their leader or whatever. But Jesus, he doesn't just say no, he runs. Because he understood that the image that they had of the Messiah, of the Christ, of the one that was supposed to deliver Israel, was different than his own than what he was supposed to be doing. He resisted the desire of everybody else to conform to that box. If you read the temptation of Christ that's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think it's in Mark. At least it's in Matthew and Luke. The whole thing that Satan, when Satan is tempting Jesus, the thing that Satan is tempting Jesus with aren't bad things. They're good things. But the way was wrong. The way to get to that place was wrong. And so Jesus resists. He resists our attempts to put him into this nice, neat little box. Now, whenever we got to this point, so what I was going to do for this sermon about Jesus, it was just going to be one sermon, and we were going to get it, we were going to move on to the next one. But the more I started exploring it, the more I discovered these things that Jesus said about himself. Now, in the book of John, Jesus makes 7 I am statements. So before you start panicking, we're going to make those into 7 different sermons. So we're not going to sit here all day. Because I started exploring each of them, and I began to think about, well, how does Jesus talk about himself? How does Jesus describe his mission? How does Jesus say the things that he is going to do? So these statements, and I want to explore one each week, and it's going to lead us right up into Easter. They are important. Each of these statements begin with the phrase, I am. Now, little thought experiment for you. This is not homework. You can do it here. I've been giving you homework sometimes. This isn't homework, but just a little thought experiment for you. If you had to make 7 statements about yourself using the phrase, I am, what would you say? What would you say? How would you describe yourself? If you said, I am, you were going to introduce yourself. I am blank. Mine goes something like this. I'm Marcus Hutto. I'm 38 years old. I'm Amy's husband. I'm Ben and Blair's dad. I am the pastor of Project Restoration. I am an occupational therapist. And I am happy. Now you get the idea. When we identify ourselves by what we do, or our state of being. Yours may be just a little bit different, but it's probably pretty similar. But here's the funny thing about these statements that Jesus makes. We can reflect on all the titles and definitions that we have attached to Jesus as Christians and as the church for the last 2,000 years, and he never uses a single one of them to describe himself. He never says, I am Jesus, the Christ, or the Messiah. He never says, I am the Son of God. He never says, I am the second member of the Trinity. Now, he does love to ask disciples these questions about who they say that he is. But when he is talking about himself, he chooses instead, rather than clearly state these things we've spent 2,000 years as a church trying to develop with creeds and statements of faith, he uses everyone's favorite literary device, including mine, metaphor. And we all know how much Marcus detests Jesus' use of simile and metaphor. Remember, if you could look back over my Kingdom of Heaven series, whenever Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, he would always use a simile. And he would say, the kingdom of heaven is like a field. The kingdom of heaven is like a pearl. The kingdom of heaven is like a net. And I'm like, would you just come out and tell us really what it's about? Quit using these funny little stories and these little descriptors and things like that. Can you just tell me? Just tell me. But he doesn't. He uses these things, these descriptions, because what it does is it makes us work for it. There's always a bit of mystery to it. Even though most of us can interact with these concrete things like a field or a seed or a net, we never quite know what Jesus is trying to say. We're always having to interact with it. There's always something new to be learned. So when people would question Jesus about who he was, and they did a lot, they would just say, who are you? Who are you to talk like this? Rather than come out and say things directly, he would speak in metaphor. 7 times it's recorded in John that he does this. And for me, each of these are probably more important than anything else we have written in creeds for the last 2,000 years. So we're going to start with one today. John 6, 25 through 35. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval." Then they asked him, What must we do to do the work God requires?" Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." So they asked him, "What sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do?" "Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." So a little bit of backstory. So in the first part of this chapter, Jesus feeds the 5,000 on the side of the lake. And then what he does is he sends his disciples on ahead, and then he walks on water to get out there to them. And the crowd is astounded. They don't know where he went. So they go follow him on the other side of the lake. And they're like, "How did you get here?" And that's where we pick up this story. And Jesus, he kind of ribs them a little bit. He says, "You're coming to me not because of the signs and the teachings, but because I fed you. I fed you with food. So that's why you're seeking me out." And so then he kind of begins this dialogue with them. Don't work for food that spoils, but food that endures. And so then they're like, "Well, how do we do this work, the works that God requires?" And so Jesus tells them to believe in the one he has sent. But then they want a sign. And that's where this, in the literal translation, it's a little hard, but they want a sign. So they say, "So what sign are you going to give that God sent you?" Because, in the desert, back in the Old Testament, Moses, he fed us with bread from heaven. And so they're kind of interacting with Jesus. They're saying, "Look, you just insulted us, but we know from the Old Testament, the sign was bread. The sign was food." Keep in mind, this is a people that are, these are subsistence people. They don't always know where their next meal is coming from. So a lot of their thoughts revolve around this. And so then Jesus kind of clarifies. He says, "Now Moses, he didn't give you the bread. God did. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven, and it's the thing that gives life to the world." So they're like, "Okay, then give us this bread. We want this bread." And Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. I am the thing that sustains you." Now this is a powerful metaphor, I think, for these poor people who lived literally from meal to meal. Bread was the basic source of sustenance for the world at the time of Jesus. Keep in mind, there's no refrigeration. So if you needed to keep food, you needed to smoke meat over a fire in order to preserve it, or you could bake grain into bread and you could carry it with you. I think about even today, we mark really good meals by the type of bread we serve. And there are few smells in the world like fresh baked bread. I mean, I love a good bakery. I really do. So I think it is a fitting, if we're talking about these 7 statements, I think it's a fitting opening statement for Jesus. I am the bread of life. Jesus is essentially saying, look in your lives. Look, if you have been searching for this thing that will make you content, the thing that will give your life meaning, but you haven't been able to find it in the material world. Like what happens with physical eating, you just get hungry again. The thing that was supposed to make everything make sense loses its luster. It gets old. It wears out. Jesus tells them that's because you're chasing after things that aren't eternal. And I think it's the great failure of the modern world and even of the church that while we live in this world, we work, and we work for justice and we work for the kingdom here. There is a deeper foundation to everything that we do, a deeper source, something that is eternal, something that is going to last beyond our lives here. Our mission is always bigger. Jesus looks to me and says, he looks at me and then he looks at everybody, he says, look to me, I am the thing. I am the thing. And it's not just something that I give you, but it's who I am. It is my very person that is with you. I am the bread of life. I am the thing that sustains you in this existence. Now, the funny thing about bread, when we think about it, is that it's useless unless it is consumed. It doesn't do anything sitting on a table or a plate. It has to be eaten. It has to be broken. For Jesus to really work in our lives, we have to take him into ourselves. We have to really believe on this work that he did on the cross. We have to study the ways that he lived, and we have to take up our own cross. Bread is only good if it is consumed. Jesus is only good for us if we take him into our lives. Too often we think about salvation in the terms of simply a belief about Jesus, something Jesus did, not something that Jesus does. We just simply acknowledge that this story about Jesus is true. And we will use all the titles to describe him, Christ, Messiah, Son of God. But believing in the words doesn't change us. I want you to look at your life today, my church, and the question becomes, what is it that sustains you? If you notice behind me, we're fixing to celebrate communion. I couldn't help write this sermon and not celebrate the table. Because remember that this life that we have, it doesn't depend on us, but on Jesus and on God, and we rely on that. And when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, you know, whenever he gathered his disciples together at the end and he had this meal with them, and it's a powerful symbol when we take this together. If somebody wants to go ahead and get the kiddos, we can start bringing the kiddos in. I'm telling you the most solemn and sober truth now. Whoever believes in me has real life, eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna bread in the desert and died. But now here is bread that truly comes down out of heaven, and anyone eating this bread will not die ever. I am the bread, living bread, who came down out of heaven. Anyone who eats this bread will live and forever. The bread that I present to the world so that it can eat and live is myself, the flesh and blood self. At this, the Jews started fighting among themselves. How can this man serve up his flesh for a meal? But Jesus doesn't give an inch. Only insofar as you eat and drink flesh and blood, the flesh and blood of the Son of Man, do you have life within you. The one who brings a hearty appetite to this eating and drinking has eternal life and will be fit and ready for the final day. My flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. By eating my flesh and drinking my blood, you enter into me and I into you, in the same way that the fully alive Father sent me here, and I live because of him, so that the one who makes a meal of me lives because of me. This is the bread of heaven. Now, for those of you, if you've never participated in a communion service,